The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After 9 years, it is clear that this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost or the corruption. The Auditor General delivered a shocking report this week that outlined a history of wasted money, conflicts of interest, and possible illegal and criminal activity in funneling taxpayers' funds to Liberal-friendly board appointees' own companies. Now, let's just set the context a little bit, Madam Speaker. Right now, Canadians are living through complete misery. Government-caused inflation leading to high interest rates means that Canadians are hit with a brutal double whammy of not only having to pay higher prices at the store, but also having to pay higher interest payments on their debt, everything from lines of credit to mortgages. So they're paying more for the goods they buy and they're paying more for the money they owe. This comes after the Prime Minister promised Canadians that interest rates would stay low for a very long time. He also promised Canadians that he was going to go into debt so they didn't have to. Cold comfort now for the hundreds of thousands of Canadians that are facing default on their mortgages as those rates keep rising, pushing people out of the homes that they've lived in for years. In many cases, tragic stories of people moving back in with their parents because they've lost the ability to stay in their house. This is all caused by wasteful government spending, pushing up prices, and forcing the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates at the fastest pace in Canadian history to combat that inflation. Now, the government will try to tell you that it's not their fault. The Prime Minister loves to spread blame around. He's always looking for people to pin responsibility on anyone other than himself. They say ridiculous things like there's global inflation, as if inflation was kind of like the weather, that you might have a warm front move in off the Gulf and you might have some pesky inflation plaguing Canadians. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary problem. It's always caused when governments print money that they don't have out of thin air, flooding the economy with brand new cash without any growth in economic activity to justify that expansion of the money supply. So when we point that out to the Liberals, they say, well, in fairness, Canada was going through a pandemic and we had to spend all this money to keep Canadians safe. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer found out that 40% of all that extra spending had nothing to do with the pandemic. And now, slowly but surely, we're learning what actually happened. The Liberals used the excuse of a pandemic to line the pockets of their friends, to waste taxpayers' money, not only during that critical period of the pandemic, but also in the years that have followed, when Canadians are begging this government to get that inflation and interest rates under control. This government keeps borrowing billions and billions to spend, not benefiting Canadians, but lining the pockets of their friends. I've got so much to say here, Madam Speaker. I don't think I'm going to fit it all in my slot, so I'm going to share my time with the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's, because I know that he's been working hard on this file. He's one of the members of Parliament who rolled up their sleeves, poured through documents, vigilantly looking for waste of taxpayers' money, because on this side of the House, we know Canadians work so hard for the money they earn. The least they can expect is a government that respects the value of that hard work and their tax dollar. So, we can run through a few of the greatest hits of Liberal corruption during the pandemic. Remember the time the Prime Minister tried to funnel $1 billion to his friends at the We organization, an organization that had paid members of his own family, paid members of the Trudeau family hundreds of thousands of dollars for speaking fees. Remember the former Liberal MP, Frank Baylis, who suddenly, without ever having experience in the field, developed a medical fabrication company that didn't actually produce anything, getting sole source contracts from the government. In the past few months, we've learned more and more about the Arrive scam app, where the government ballooned costs for IT services without any accountability or oversight of where that money was going. It is clear that the Liberals use crises and attempts to to fulfill noble causes, to hide the corruption that they have become so famous for. And now we have an example. The Liberals talk about the crisis that Canadians are facing. They try to justify all their wasteful spending and all their massive tax hikes on the backs of existential threats coming from climate change. But now we know that their efforts to improve the environment have nothing to do with lowering emissions, but everything to do with doling out cash to people who have supported this Liberal Party in a very real way. So let's look at what the Auditor General found. $76 million in taxpayers' money was paid out in direct conflict of interest. That means there were people on the board, people who made the decisions about where the money was going, that should have recused themselves because they had a financial interest in some of the companies that were getting contracts. In fact, the Auditor General found, and through investigations at committee, we found out that there were government representatives in almost all the board meetings when these decisions were being made. So there can't be any excuse that this government has that this corruption was happening in some kind of arm's length way. They were in the room. They were in the room when they were being warned that there were conflicts of interest. They were in the room when the decisions were made. They were in the room when they found out that the companies getting the contracts were at least partially owned, if not entirely owned, by members of the board themselves. So for Canadians who are following along with this story, basically what the government did is they took an existing agency, SDTC Canada, which, by the way, had been fulfilling all its governance requirements up until 2017, and something peculiar happened. Former Liberal Minister Navdeep Bains, he didn't like something that the chair of that board said, something about protecting Canadians' privacy. That rubbed Navdeep Bains the wrong way. So he fired that chair and he appointed one that would be much, much more cooperative with the Liberal government. And that's when the problems started. The chronology is stark. When he was minister, Navdeep Bains goes on to appoint another 5 controversial board members who engaged in unethical and illegal behavior by approving funding to companies in which they held ownership or held seats on the board. There are examples of those officials sitting in on the board as observers witnessed 96 conflicts of interest. But the board didn't intervene. Sorry, the officials didn't intervene. We've got examples here from the Auditor General's report of $59 million paid out to projects that did not qualify. And I want to read what the Auditor General said about that. She said, and I quote, "These projects were ineligible for funding because, for example, they did not support the development or demonstration of a new technology." The entire point of this agency, the entire point of this funding mechanism was to incubate, was to find potential technologies that might help reduce emissions, clean up particulate matter from the air. And the whole purpose was that they would grant some of these funds to scale up some of these innovative technologies. And what the Auditor General is saying that in their own project application, there was no proof that there would be any benefit to the environment. Not that they tried and failed, not that they were hoping that some new technology would work and despite their best efforts, it wasn't fruitful. That happens all the time in the world of scientific innovation and inventions. People are, they take ideas, they test them, and sometimes they don't work, and they learn from that and they go on to the next thing. But in this situation, the applications themselves couldn't even speak, couldn't even point to any environmental benefit. Very quickly, Madam Speaker, because I see I'm almost out of time, $6 million charged to taxpayers for projects that weren't even built, over $123 million in misappropriated funds, and as I mentioned, over 180 conflicts of interest at the funds. So here we have an example of Canadians suffering through one of the biggest cost of living crises since the Great Depression. Mothers watering down milk to feed their children, people moving back in with their parents, single moms working 2, maybe even 3 jobs just to tread water, not with any hope of getting ahead, but just keeping a roof over themselves and their family. And while all this is happening, while the Prime Minister is claiming that every single penny he needs to scoop out of taxpayers' pockets must go to all this spending, we find out that hundreds of millions of dollars was wasted massive conflicts of interest, and another example of liberal corruption where they reward their friends instead of respecting taxpayers' dollars. That's why this motion is so important, so we can get all the information handed to the RCMP, because, Madam Speaker, this is so serious, we believe this warrants a police investigation.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, 60% of the members' comments were in regards to the economy. Well, you know, it's interesting when he does that. When the world was seeing record high increases in interest and inflation, Canada's performance was far superior than a vast majority of the other countries, especially if you compare us to the G20 and the G7. And there is even some good news. You know, for the last 4 months, we've seen inflation being kept under control to the degree in which yesterday's announcement, Canada was the first country out of the G7 to actually see a decrease in the interest rate. This is all good news. I'm glad the Conservatives now want to start talking about the economy today, the day after, but I'm wondering if he could provide his thoughts in regards to the good news that Canada is the first of the G7 countries to actually decrease the interest rates.
I do want to remind members that if they want to participate in the debate, they wait for the appropriate time. The Honourable Government House Leader, the Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Madam Speaker, we have an Auditor General's report that may very well end up with an RCMP investigation and perhaps criminal charges, and the Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader, can't even defend it. There's not anything that the member can defend in the Auditor General's report. Did the Auditor General get anything wrong? Was she wrong when she said $76 million in taxpayers' money was paid out in direct conflicts of interest? Was she wrong when she said that $123 million in total was misappropriated? Was she wrong when she said that $59 million was given out to companies that didn't even qualify? No. The member wants to get up and say, don't worry, Madam Speaker, Canadians should take heart that it's worse in some other parts of the world. That's not good enough, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. The Honourable for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the travesties with this situation has been the workers that have been involved. What the government did is they funded this agency 100% from public taxpayers' federal money, but then they gave the workers no protection, no union, no protection under laws for whistleblowing, but we had people come forward. They've lost their jobs, they face sexism, they face racism, they face attacks because they came from French Canada, and some have had their names dragged through the mud consistently on this. So my question is about the justice for these workers that came forward, because none of this would have happened. There was actually 3 investigations that have culminated to this. So my question is, will the Conservatives agree to stronger whistleblower protection and also moving some of the workers that are paid 100% federally under the umbrella system where they get unionization and representation so they and their families can have the sanctity of telling the truth when necessary to protect all Canadians?
The Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
I want to thank my honourable member for the question. He raises another aspect of this that I didn't have time to cover, but I'm glad that he did, and that is the abominable treatment of the whistleblowers in this whole sordid affair. For example, we find out that Andre Lise Methot is the founder of a green venture capital firm called Cycle Capital. During her time on the board at SDTC, companies in which Cycle Capital was invested received $42 million from SDTC. So that's a board member who oversaw the distribution of those funds. Do you know who used to serve as strategic advisor at Cycle Capital from 2009 to 2018? The Minister of the Environment. That's some of the shocking things that we found out. And he's absolutely right. There was terrible treatment of these employees. Conservatives believe in protection for whistleblowers. It was our government that brought in the Accountability Act that prevented reprisals against whistleblowers, and we absolutely support methods or measures that would protect those whistleblowers and those workers that were treated so terribly by this government.
Une brève question. We have time for a brief question. The Honourable Member South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the most shocking things in the Auditor General's report is that there's 2 groups, she classified 2 groups of conflict of interest decisions. The first group was 96 occasions where the board members declared a conflict of interest but then awarded themselves money. But the most shocking part is that $76 million, which is another 90 times when these board members didn't have the courage to share that they had a conflict of interest. Wow. That they, 186 times, half of which they hid. So I'm asking the member, why does he think someone would be appointed to the board with that kind of ethics?
A brief answer from the Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Well, I think the member's absolutely right. You know, Canadians would ask themselves, well, why would a government do this? You know, why would they have government officials in the room overseeing these types of decisions, knowing that there were these conflicts of interest? I think it goes back to the fact that this is the desired outcome. This is why a Liberal minister put his friends on the board. And they say the fish rots from the top. The Prime Minister faces no consequences for his myriad conflicts, and he's got other ministers that have had similar types of findings against him. The Prime Minister's been convicted 3 times. Nothing happens to the ministers, nothing happens to the Prime Ministers, so you can see the culture of corruption that this Prime Minister has created.
Great.